known around the world for its skyline. A forest of steel rising from the Midwest. Glass towers catching the light from the sky. This is the Chicago that people recognize. But it did not always look like this. Chicago, before steel and concrete, was different than you could ever imagine.
The shipment from the mill is late again.
Aye, the roads are dreadful this time of year.
A city where most buildings, homes, shops, warehouses, were built from timber. Chicago, in the early 1870s, was a booming industrial metropolis. Ambitious, overcrowded, and expanding faster than its foundations could sustain. The city's skyline stretched low and wide across the horizon. The main branch of the Chicago River, along with its north and south branches, traced nearly the same path as they do today, but their banks were lined with low warehouses and timber yards.
Put that sack right there.
This river was once far murkier than it is today, thick with sediment, industrial waste, and the constant traffic of barges and lumber ships. Chicago stood at the center of the nation's rail network, along with timber pouring in from across the Midwest. It grew into the largest lumber market in the United States. Homes, shops, warehouses, entire blocks rose from wooden frames. Even the sidewalks were made of wood, raised above the mud-soaked streets. Most roads were still unpaved, thick with dirt and ruts. Steel rails ran along the streets, carrying horse-drawn streetcars through the crowded city. Because lumber was abundant and inexpensive, most buildings in early 1870s Chicago were wood-framed, commonly designed in the Italianate and Second Empire styles. Smoke hung constantly above the rooftops. Coal furnaces, factory stacks, and thousands of chimneys released soot into the air, casting a grey haze over the city and settling dust onto streets, windows, and the surface of the river.
This morning, ma'am.
What is the price for a full sack of that grain?
5 cents, same as yesterday. Eve, together now.
Lumberwork and construction were among the most common trades in the city, employing thousands in sawmills, rail yards, carpentry shops, and on building sites that never seemed to rest. Most of the city's lumber came from the vast pine forests of Wisconsin and Michigan, transported south through the Great Lakes and into Chicago's busy river yards.
All right, lads, heave! Push it up now!
Trade was another dominant force in the city's economy, as Chicago served as a central exchange point where grain, meat, lumber, and manufactured goods moved between the Midwest and the rest of the nation. Chicago's location gave it a decisive advantage. By 1870, 11 major railroad lines converged here, moving millions of tons of grain, lumber, livestock, and manufactured goods each year between the industrial East and the expanding West. This vast rail system, along with the dominance in lumber and grain trade, were the key forces behind Chicago's extraordinary prosperity at the time.
Extra! Extra! Read all about it! Get your easy...
In the early 1870s, Chicago was a city alive with motion and ambition. Rooftops were crowded with chimneys, each one releasing smoke into the restless Midwestern sky. The city was home to nearly 300,000 people, expanding at a pace few American cities had ever seen. The streets were already laid out in a strict grid, but most of them were still unpaved, thick with dirt and deep wagon ruts. At the time, men made up the primary industrial workforce, laboring in rail yards, factories, docks, and construction sites, while most women were expected to manage the home and care for children. For many people in Chicago, daily life felt relatively calm, especially in contrast to the turbulence of the Civil War that had ended just a few years earlier. By 1870, the city supported dozens of theaters, concert halls, and beer gardens, many founded by its large German immigrant community. Nightfall, the city grew noticeably quieter, especially compared to New York and other more established eastern cities. Yet trade did not fully cease, as rail yards and river docks continued moving freight well into the night. Horse-drawn freight wagons still rolled through the streets, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding against dirt roads.
We should meet at the saloon by 9. Very well.
And then, another morning arrived, as life in Chicago returned to its familiar rhythm. Stoves were lit, shop doors opened, and the trade of goods resumed along the river and rail lines.
Very well, we are agreed.
The carrots came in fresh this morning, ma'am.
What is the price for a full...
People stepped outside onto wooden sidewalks, passing timber posts and timber walls, assuming the city around them would endure as it always had.
It is quite muddy today.
Indeed. The streetcar nearly got stuck back there.
No one could imagine that in less than 2 years, much of it would be gone.